The dust came first. It always did in Kansas during harvest season, settling on windshields and tractor seats and the corners of a man's eyes. Marcus Brennan stood at the edge of his wheat field that September morning in 1979, watching the combine crawl through rows of amber grain, and he did not yet know that his life was about to change. The sky stretched endless and pale above him, the color of old bone, 72 degrees at 7 in the morning. Good weather for thrashing. The kind of weather his grandfather would have called a blessing. The field ran 280 acres. Every stalk of it descended from seeds that crossed an ocean 101 years before. Marcus knew this the way other men knew their own names. The wheat whispered in the wind, a sound like water moving over stones, and if you listened close enough, you could almost hear voices in it. Old voices, European voices, the voices of men who understood that some things should not change. He was 47 years old. His hands were large and weathered, the knuckles swollen from 4 decades of work that began before dawn and ended after dark. His face had the look of carved wood, all angles and shadows, with eyes the color of winter wheat. Not handsome, but solid. The kind of face you could trust with your life or your land, which in Kansas amounted to the same thing. The white truck appeared on the county road at 8:15, trailing its own cloud of dust like a comet. Marcus watched it turn into his drive, watched it park beside the barn where his grandfather had carved his initials into a support beam in 1879. A man climbed out, younger than Marcus by 3 years, wearing the pressed tan uniform of the Kansas Department of Agriculture, carrying a clipboard and a metal case that caught the morning light. David Hammond. They had been in high school together, had played on the same baseball team, had both dated Sarah Miller before Marcus married her, and David moved to Topeka for state work. Now David was a seed inspector, which meant he had the authority to condemn a man's crop with the stroke of a pen. Marcus did not move from where he stood. He let David walk to him, let the distance between them fill with all the years and all the choices that had made them different men. David's boots were clean. That told you everything you needed to know. "Good morning, Marcus." The words hung in the still air. "David." Marcus did not offer his hand. David did not extend his. They stood 3 feet apart, two men who had once been friends, now separated by something neither of them fully understood but both of them felt. "I am here to inspect your seed lot," David said. The words came out flat and official, rehearsed. Registration number Ks-79-2847. Turkey red winter wheat. 280 bushels for sale to the cooperative. Marcus nodded once, slow. He had been expecting this. The law required inspection before any seed lot could be sold, and he had filed the paperwork 6 weeks before. Everything by the book, everything proper. But there was something in David's posture, in the way he held the clipboard against his chest like a shield, that made Marcus's jaw tighten. "You will find it in the east barn," Marcus said. "Second row, marked with the yellow tags." They walked together without speaking. The barn was cool and dim, smelling of dust and oil and the sweet dry scent of stored grain. Sunlight fell through gaps in the boards, cutting the darkness into slices. The seed lot sat in burlap sacks stacked 8 high, each one stamped with Marcus's name and the date of harvest. 280 bushels. $12,000 worth of wheat at current prices. Nearly a full year's profit from the seed operation. David set down his case and opened it with precise movements. Inside lay instruments Marcus did not recognize. Glass tubes, small metal scoops, bottles of liquid, the tools of a profession that had not existed when his grandfather first planted this wheat. "I will need to take samples," David said, "from multiple sacks, random selection." "Do what you need to do." Marcus leaned against a support beam and watched. David moved through the rows with the efficiency of practice, plunging a hollow tube into one sack after another, extracting cores of seed that he deposited into clear containers. 20 samples in total, each one labeled with numbers that meant nothing to Marcus but everything to the state. When David was finished, he carried his samples to a wooden table near the barn door where the light was better. He spread them out in rows. He studied them in silence for a long time, and Marcus saw his expression change, saw the way his lips pressed together, saw the small shake of his head that men make when they have discovered something they do not want to find. "What is it?" Marcus asked, though he already knew. David looked up, and for just a moment there was something like regret in his eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by the mask of official duty. "This is not pure turkey red," David said. His voice was quiet but firm. "There is significant contamination. I am seeing at least 4 distinct seed types in these samples, maybe more." Marcus pushed away from the beam and walked to the table. He picked up one of the containers, held it to the light. The seeds inside were not uniform. Some were dark red, some lighter. Some were plump, others more elongated. To David's eyes, this was disorder. To Marcus's eyes, this was family. "It is not contamination," Marcus said. "The state definition is clear. Turkey red must be 98% pure. This does not meet that standard." "My grandfather brought these seeds from Moravia in 1878, Marcus said. "They have looked like this for 100 years. "Then your grandfather was growing contaminated stock." The words landed like a slap. Marcus set down the container with care, fighting the urge to grab David by his clean collar and throw him out of the barn. He had learned long ago that anger was a luxury farmers could not afford. "How much contamination?" Marcus asked. David consulted his notes. "Preliminary estimate, 18.7%. I will need to do a full laboratory analysis to confirm, but based on field testing, I cannot approve this lot for sale." 18.7%. The number sat between them like a stone. "That is impossible," Marcus said. "I have been selling this seed for 23 years. Never had a problem." "Laws change," David said. "Standards get stricter. What passed inspection in 1956 does not pass in 1979. I am sorry, Marcus, but this is not personal. This is policy." "Policy," Marcus repeated. The word tasted like ashes. David closed his case with a decisive click. "I will send my full report to the department within 10 days. You will receive official notification by mail. You cannot sell this seed lot until it meets purity standards. If you attempt to do so, you will be in violation of Kansas Seed Law 1907, which carries fines up to $5,000 and possible criminal charges." Marcus did not respond. He watched David walk back to his truck, watched him drive away trailing dust that hung in the air long after the engine sound faded. Then he was alone in the barn with 280 bushels of wheat that the state of Kansas had declared worthless. The sun climbed higher. The day grew hot. Marcus stood there until Sarah came looking for him at noon, worry creased into her forehead. "What did he say?" she asked. "He said it is contaminated." "Can you fix it?" "No." One word, simple and final. Sarah was 43, still beautiful in the way of women who have worked hard and loved harder. She wore a cotton dress printed with small flowers, and her hands smelled like the bread she had been baking when she heard the truck. She took Marcus's arm, and they stood together in the barn's cool darkness, not speaking, because there was nothing useful to say. That evening, Marcus drove to town to tell the cooperative he could not deliver the seed. The manager, a man named Peterson with thin wire glasses and thinning hair, took the news badly. I already have 3 contracts dependent on your lot, Peterson said. Spring farmers in Ellis County. They specifically requested Brennan seed. I cannot sell what the state will not certify. Then grow something else next year. Modern varieties. Certified stock from the seed companies. Marcus looked at Peterson across the desk cluttered with invoices and order forms, and he saw in the man's eyes the same thing he had seen in David's eyes. The future, cold and standardized and inevitable. A future that had no room for seeds that did not match a government chart. I will think about it, Marcus said, which was his way of saying no. He drove home through the evening, the truck radio playing country songs about lost loves and hard times, and when he pulled into his drive, he saw his son William's car already parked by the house. The boy was home from college. Not a boy anymore, really. 22 years old, freshly graduated with a degree in mechanical engineering from Kansas State. Smart as a whip, Sarah always said. Too smart to waste his life on a dying farm. William was in the kitchen when Marcus entered, drinking iced tea and talking with his mother about a job offer. Marcus caught the tail end of it. Boeing in Seattle. $42,000 a year. Start date in January. That is good money, Sarah was saying. Real good money. William looked up when Marcus entered, and there was something defensive in his posture, as if he expected a fight. Dad, William said, Mom told me about the inspection. Marcus poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove, even though it was 8 at night and still 80 degrees outside. He needed something to do with his hands. It is what it is, Marcus said. What are you going to do? William asked. Keep farming. You cannot sell the seed. I can still plant it. On how much land? William pressed. You were counting on that seed money to pay for next year's inputs. Without it, you are looking at what, 80 acres instead of 200, maybe less. Marcus drank his coffee. It was bitter and strong, the way he liked it. I will figure it out. William set down his glass with enough force to make ice cubes rattle. Dad, this farm is dying. The whole family farm model is dying. Agribusiness is taking over. You cannot compete with operations running 5,000 acres with satellite-guided combines and computer-managed irrigation. You just cannot. His grandfather could not compete with mechanical reapers either, Marcus said. He managed. His grandfather did not have $200,000 in debt. William shot back. The number hung in the air between them. Sarah's face went pale. She had not known it was that much. Marcus had kept that particular truth from her, the way he kept most hard truths from her, because he believed it was a husband's job to carry such burdens alone. Where did you hear that number? Marcus asked quietly. I looked at the books last Christmas, William said. The ledgers in your office. I wanted to understand what I would be inheriting if I stayed. And what I found out is that I would be inheriting nothing but debt and obligation. So you are taking the Seattle job. It was not a question. I think I have to, Dad. I am sorry, but I think I have to. Sarah started crying then, soft and quiet, the way she cried when she did not want to be noticed. Marcus set down his coffee cup and walked past both of them, out the back door, into the yard where the cottonwood trees threw long shadows across grass that needed mowing. He stood there as the sky turned from blue to purple to black. He stood there as the first stars appeared, the same stars that had watched his grandfather plant the first crop in 1879. The land around him stretched dark and infinite, and somewhere in that darkness were 280 bushels of seed that the modern world had deemed unfit. But Marcus knew better. He had seen this wheat survive droughts that killed commercial varieties. He had seen it come back from winter kill that wiped out whole counties. He had seen it produce grain year after year without the chemical fertilizers and pesticides that other farmers poured onto their land like medicine onto a dying patient. The wheat was not contaminated. The wheat was alive in a way that pure-bred varieties could never be. It carried within its genes the memory of 100 harvests, 100 winters, 100 springs. It carried the wisdom of survival. Marcus made his decision standing there in the dark under the stars that did not care about Kansas seed law or government inspectors or sons who wanted to escape to Seattle. He would plant it all. Every bushel, every seed, 280 bushels across 160 acres, double his normal density. It would cost him everything. The bank would have to extend his line of credit. Sarah would have to go back to work at the diner in town. They would eat beans and rice for a year. But he would do it because some things mattered more than money, more than comfort, more than the approval of the modern world. He would do it because his grandfather had not carried those seeds across an ocean, for them to die in a government barn. The back door opened and Sarah came out, her face still wet. "Marcus," she said. He turned to face her. "I am planting it all," he said. "All of what?" "All the seed, the whole lot, 160 acres." Sarah closed her eyes. When she opened them, they held a kind of resigned acceptance, the look of a woman who had loved a stubborn man for 25 years and knew that stubborn men did not change. "We will go broke," she said. "Maybe. Probably." "Probably," he agreed. She walked to him then and took his hand, her small fingers lacing through his large ones. "Your grandfather would be proud of you," she said, "and also possibly rolling in his grave at your foolishness." Marcus almost smiled, almost. "I need to show you something," he said. They walked to the machine shed where Marcus kept his truck and his tools, and in a locked cabinet in the back corner, the things that mattered most. He opened the cabinet with a key he wore on a chain around his neck. Inside were his grandfather's papers, deeds, letters, a leather journal cracked with age, and a tin box. Marcus lifted the box out with both hands, careful, as if it held something fragile, which in a way it did. He set it on his workbench and opened the lid. Inside, wrapped in yellowed cloth, were seeds. Old seeds. The original seeds Marcus Brennan had brought from Moravia in 1878, preserved as a kind of reference, a standard against which all future crops could be measured. Sarah looked at them in the dim light of the shed's single bulb. "They look exactly like what you harvested this year," she said. Marcus nodded. "Exactly. Which means my grandfather brought contaminated seed. Which means this contamination, this variation, has been there from the very beginning. It is not a mistake. It is the design." He pulled out the journal, opened it to a page marked with a strip of ribbon. His grandmother had translated some passages into English years before she died, writing in pencil in the margins. Marcus read aloud. September 1881. The winter wheat has survived another Kansas freeze. Many of my neighbors lost their crops to the cold, but mine endures. I believe it is because I keep the old ways from Moravia. We do not select for uniformity as the Americans do. We keep variety. We keep the weak seeds alongside the strong, the early alongside the late, the tall alongside the short. This is how our families survived centuries in the cold lands. This is how we will survive here. Sarah touched the page gently. "I never knew he wrote this." "There is more," Marcus said. He flipped forward several pages. March 1883. The seed merchant from Salina came today. He says my wheat is impure. He says I must buy certified Turkey red from his company if I want to sell grain to the mills. I told him my wheat is older than his company, older than his country, older than his ideas of pure and impure. He left angry. I do not care. Some things are not for sale." The words settled around them like snow. Sarah looked at Marcus with something close to wonder. "He was just like you," she said. "Or I am just like him." She kissed him then, there in the machine shed that smelled of grease and gasoline and the dust of 100 years. When she pulled away, her eyes were serious. "Plant it all," she said. "Plant every seed. If we are going to go down, we will go down fighting." The next morning, Marcus began preparations. He spent 3 days servicing his equipment, old machinery that should have been replaced a decade before but still ran because he knew how to coax life from metal and oil. His John Deere 4020 tractor, purchased used in 1968. His grain drill, even older. His cultivator and his disc and his sprayer, all of them held together with wire and hope and intimate knowledge of their particular quirks. William helped, though reluctantly. The boy said little, working with the mechanical precision of someone who understood machines better than he understood his father. But he worked, and for that Marcus was grateful. On the 4th day, a truck pulled into the yard. Tom Miller climbed out, all 6'3" of him, wearing new Levi's and a shirt so white it hurt to look at. Tom owned the biggest operation in the county, 3,000 acres of wheat and corn and soybeans managed with computers and satellite imagery and hired help who did not speak English. He was not a friend exactly, but he was a neighbor, which in Kansas meant you helped each other at harvest and pretended to like each other at church. "Heard about your inspection trouble," Tom said by way of greeting. "News travels fast. Peterson at the co-op mentioned it, said you are planting the whole lot anyway." "That is the plan." Tom laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Marcus, that is financial suicide. You know that, right? That seed is worthless. Even if you get a decent crop, who is going to buy grain from contaminated seed?" "I am not growing it for seed," Marcus said. "I am growing it for grain." "Same problem. The mills want consistency. They want to know what they are getting. Your wheat will test all over the place for protein and gluten. They will dock you 20–30% on price. Then they will dock me." Tom shook his head, the way you shake your head at a man who has decided to drive his truck off a cliff. "You could sell this place tomorrow," Tom said. "I know for a fact that ConAgra is looking to expand in this area. They would give you $400,000 for your 240 acres, maybe more if you negotiated. You could retire, move to town. Let William take that Boeing job without feeling guilty about abandoning the family legacy." Marcus looked at Tom Miller in his white shirt and his new jeans and his boots that had never touched mud, and he saw exactly what the future looked like if he sold. He saw the land divided up and absorbed into some corporation spreadsheet. He saw the barn torn down. He saw the field planted with patented soybeans designed in a laboratory 3 states away. He saw everything his grandfather had built erased as thoroughly as if it had never existed. "I am not selling," Marcus said. "You are making a mistake." "Probably." Tom Miller drove away without another word, and Marcus watched the dust settle behind him. Then he climbed onto his tractor and began to disc the east field, turning under the stubble of last year's crop, preparing the ground for seed that the world considered worthless but that he knew was priceless. The work took 2 weeks, disking and harrowing and dragging the field until the soil was broken fine and dark. His back ached, his hands blistered, but the pain felt good because it was honest pain, the kind that came from labor and not from worry. Sarah went back to work at the diner, 6 days a week, breakfast and lunch shift. She came home smelling like bacon grease and coffee, exhausted but determined. She did not complain, not once. Instead, she put the money in a jar in the kitchen, bills and coins slowly accumulating toward the credit extension they would need from the bank. William spent most of his time in his old bedroom, working on applications for other jobs in case Boeing fell through. He rarely came to the fields. Marcus did not push him. You could not force a man to love the land. Either it got into your blood or it did not, and it was clear that whatever was in William's blood, it was not this. In mid-October, Marcus received the official letter from the Kansas Department of Agriculture. It arrived in a manila envelope marked official business, and inside was a form letter signed by someone whose title was Assistant Deputy Director of Seed Certification. The language was bureaucratic and cold. The seed lot designated Ks 792847 had failed purity standards with a contamination rate of 18.7%. Sale of said seed lot was prohibited under Kansas Seed Law 1907. Violation of this prohibition would result in civil penalties up to $5,000 and potential criminal prosecution. Marcus read the letter once, folded it carefully, and filed it in the cabinet with his grandfather's papers. Then he went to the bank. The banker was a young man named Stevens, 30 years old at most, who had taken over when old Mr. Hartley retired. Stevens had a degree in finance from Wichita State and no understanding whatsoever of how farming actually worked. He looked at Marcus's request for a $15,000 credit extension, the way a doctor might look at a terminal diagnosis. "Mr. Brennan," Stevens said, "I have reviewed your financials. Your current debt-to-asset ratio is not favorable for additional lending. You are already leveraged at 160%. I need the money for spring planting," Marcus said. "Perhaps this would be a good time to consider downsizing your operation," Stevens suggested. "Sell off some acreage to reduce debt. Focus on a smaller, more manageable footprint." "I am not selling." Stevens sighed. "Then I cannot approve this extension, not with your current risk profile." Marcus stood up. He was not a tall man, but in that moment, in that small office with its fake wood paneling, and its pictures of wheat fields that Stevens had probably never walked through, he seemed to fill the room. "My grandfather banked with this institution for 40 years, Marcus said quietly. "My father for 40 more. I have been banking here since 1954. In all that time, have we ever missed a payment?" "No, but..." "Have we ever defaulted on a loan?" "No." "Then you will approve this extension." Stevens looked down at his papers, then back up at Marcus, and something passed between them. Some understanding that had nothing to do with debt ratios or risk profiles. Stevens had power, but Marcus had something more powerful, the weight of honor and history and a handshake that meant something. "I can give you 10,000, Stevens said finally. "That is the absolute limit, and your interest rate goes up 2 points. "Done." Marcus signed the papers and walked out into October sunshine that felt like a blessing. 10,000 would not be enough, but it would have to be. The planting began on October 28, 1979. Marcus started before dawn, filling the grain drill's hopper with seed from the condemned lot. Each seed went into the ground like a prayer, like an act of defiance, like a promise kept to a dead man who had carried these same seeds across an ocean in a wooden trunk. William came out to watch, standing at the edge of the field with his hands in his pockets. "You are really doing this," William said. "I am really doing this." "What if it fails?" "Then it fails. And we lose everything." "We already lost everything the day they condemned the seed," Marcus said. "Now we are just deciding what we stand for." The tractor moved across the field in straight lines, the drill behind it cutting furrows and dropping seed at precise intervals. Marcus drove for 16 hours that day, stopping only to refill the hopper and drink water and piss behind the machine shed. When darkness came, he rigged spotlights to the tractor and kept going. Sarah brought him dinner at midnight, a thermos of soup and sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. She sat with him while he ate, neither of them talking, just being together in the dark field under stars that had watched countless plantings and would watch countless more. "This is crazy," Sarah said finally. "I know, but you are doing it anyway." Marcus finished his soup and handed her the thermos. His hands were shaking from exhaustion and vibration and something deeper, something that felt like fear and faith mixed together until you could not tell them apart. "My grandfather walked away from everything he knew," Marcus said. "His family, his country, his language. He got on a boat with nothing but clothes and seeds and faith that the land across the ocean would accept him. If he could do that, I can plant a field that bureaucrats do not approve of." Sarah kissed his forehead. "You are a stubborn man, Marcus Brennan." "I come from stubborn people." He finished planting on November 2nd. 160 acres of wheat that should not have been planted, that violated state law, that represented every dollar and every hope he had left. When the last seed dropped from the drill, Marcus shut off the tractor and sat in the sudden silence, listening to the engine tick as it cooled, listening to his own heartbeat, listening to the sound of wind moving across bare earth that would soon be covered in green shoots if the weather held, and the seeds germinated and God was merciful. He climbed down from the tractor on legs that barely held him and stood at the edge of the field as the sun rose behind him, casting his shadow long across the freshly planted ground. Somewhere in that soil, invisible and waiting, 280 bushels of contaminated seed were beginning their transformation. In a week, they would sprout. In a month, they would be green. In 7 months, they would either prove him a fool or prove him right. Marcus did not know which outcome was more terrifying. That evening, Tom Miller drove past the field slowly, staring at the worked ground. He did not stop. He did not wave. He just drove past and shook his head, and Marcus knew what he was thinking. He was thinking that by spring, he would be able to buy this land at auction for pennies on the dollar. But Tom Miller did not know what František Brennan had known in 1878. He did not know that survival was not about perfection. He did not know that strength came from diversity, not uniformity. He did not know that the seeds now sleeping in that Kansas soil carried within them the memory of centuries, the wisdom of adaptation, the stubborn refusal to die that had kept the Brennan family alive through pogroms and ocean crossings and dust bowls and depressions. Tom Miller saw contamination. Marcus saw family. And in the end, only one of them would be right. The green came up in November like a promise. Marcus walked the fields every morning after the first shoots appeared, checking germination rates, looking for bare patches, searching for signs of disease or weakness. But the wheat was strong. 89% germination, which was better than most commercial varieties achieved under perfect conditions. The shoots were varied in their appearance just like the seeds had been. Some dark green, some lighter, some thick-stemmed, some thin. But all of them alive, all of them reaching toward a pale winter sky. William watched from the kitchen window one morning, coffee cup in hand, and when Marcus came in for breakfast the boy was quiet. Not hostile, exactly. Just quiet in the way of someone who has made up his mind about something but has not yet spoken it aloud. Sarah made pancakes. She worked the morning shift at the diner now, 6 to noon, then came home to manage the farm accounts and cook dinner and pretend that everything was normal. Her hands had new calluses from carrying plates and pots. Her feet ached by evening. But she never complained, and Marcus loved her more for it than he had words to express. The winter of 1979 into 1980 was mild. Temperatures stayed above freezing most days. Snow came light and melted fast. By February, the wheat was 6 inches tall, a carpet of green spreading across the brown Kansas prairie. Other farmers commented on it when Marcus went to town for feed or parts. They said his field looked good. They did not mention the failed inspection. They did not mention contamination. They just said it looked good, and their voices carried the weight of men who understood what good meant and what it cost. Tom Miller said nothing at all. March brought rain, not much but enough. The wheat grew to 12 inches, then 18. Marcus could walk between the rows and feel the green close around him like water. He could smell the earth and the growth in something else, something older, like memory made physical. David Hammond came by on a Saturday in early April. He was not in uniform. He drove his personal truck, a rusted Ford with a bad muffler, and he parked by the barn and waited for Marcus to come to him. It was a gesture of respect, that waiting, an acknowledgement that he was not here on official business. Marcus finished greasing the planter. He was preparing for corn season, wiped his hands on a rag and walked over. "David," he said. Marcus. David looked older than he had in September. There were new lines around his eyes, and his shoulders carried a kind of defeat that had not been there before. "I heard you planted the whole lot." "You heard right." "That took guts." "Or stupidity." "Maybe both," David said. He looked out at the green field stretching toward the horizon. "It looks good, Marcus. Really good." "It is too early to tell." "I suppose it is." They stood together in silence for a while, two men who had been friends once and might be again if enough time passed and enough forgiveness was granted. A meadowlark called from a fence post. The wind moved through budding cottonwood trees. "I am leaving the department," David said finally. "Resigned last week." Marcus felt something shift in his chest. "Why?" "Because I do not believe in what we are doing anymore. This whole system, Marcus, the seed certification, the purity standards, the regulations that favor big companies over family farmers, it is all rigged. I see that now. I have been seeing it for a while, but your case made it clear." "What will you do?" "I do not know yet." David kicked at a stone in the dirt. "I have some savings, not much. I thought maybe I would try farming myself. Small scale. Maybe vegetables or something. I do not know." Marcus studied him. David was not dressed for farming. His hands were soft. He had spent 20 years behind a desk, making judgments about other men's work without ever doing the work himself. But there was something in his eyes now that Marcus recognized. Hunger. The need to build something instead of just tearing things down. "I could use help," Marcus said. "I cannot pay much. 200 a month plus room and board if you need it." David looked up sharply. "You are offering me a job." "I am offering you a chance to learn what you have been regulating all these years." David laughed, but it was not a happy sound. "That is more than I deserve." "Probably," Marcus agreed, "but I am offering it anyway." David extended his hand. Marcus took it. They shook once, firm, and in that gesture was the beginning of something neither of them fully understood but both of them needed. Redemption, maybe. Or just the knowledge that it was never too late to choose a different path. David started the next Monday. He moved into the small apartment above the machine shed that had been empty since Marcus's father died. He worked from dawn until dark, learning how to drive a tractor, how to read soil, how to maintain equipment with wire and hope instead of money. His hands blistered and bled. His back screamed. But he kept working, and slowly, imperceptibly, he began to change shape. His shoulders grew broader. His face grew darker from sun. His hands grew hard. Sarah liked him. She said he reminded her of her father, who had also been a man trying to become better than he was. She made him dinner on Saturdays, pot roast and potatoes and pie, and David ate like he had never tasted real food before, which in a sense he had not. William left for Seattle on a Sunday in late April. He packed his car with everything he owned, which fit easily into a Honda Civic, and he stood in the driveway saying goodbye while Sarah cried and Marcus stood with his arms crossed, watching his son prepare to drive away from everything that mattered. "I will call every week," William said, "and I will send money when I can." "You do not need to send money," Marcus said. "I want to help. Then come back." The words hung between them. William looked at his father, and for just a moment there was something like pain in his eyes. But then it was gone, replaced by the practical certainty of a young man who had made his choice and would not be talked out of it. "I cannot come back, Dad. This place is drowning. I cannot drown with it." "Then go," Marcus said quietly. "But know that when you drive away from this land, you are driving away from every man who came before you. You are breaking a chain that goes back centuries. That is your choice to make, but it is a choice you will have to live with." William got in his car without another word. He drove away trailing dust, and Marcus watched until the dust settled and the road was empty. Then he went back to work because work was the only thing that made sense when everything else was falling apart. May brought heat. Temperatures climbed into the 90s and stayed there. The wheat grew tall, 3 feet high now, heading out with fat kernels forming in tight rows. Marcus walked the fields every evening, running his hands over the heads, feeling the grain develop, checking for rust or blight or any of the 1,000 things that could go wrong between flowering and harvest. The wheat was not uniform. That much was obvious to anyone who looked. Some heads were dark, some light. Some plants stood 4 feet tall, others barely 30 inches. The agricultural extension agent came by one day and stood at the field edge shaking his head. "You have got at least 5 distinct types here," the agent said. "Maybe more. Harvest is going to be a nightmare. You will never get consistent moisture levels." "I will manage," Marcus said. "You should have replanted with certified seed." "Should have," Marcus agreed, but did not. The agent left and Marcus stood alone at the edge of his chaotic field, and he thought about František again. His grandfather had not cared about uniformity. He had cared about survival. And survival, Marcus was beginning to understand, required diversity. It required the tall plants to shade the short ones. It required the deep-rooted plants to bring up water for the shallow-rooted ones. It required the whole system to work together, instead of every plant being identical and competing for the exact same resources at the exact same time. It was not chaos. It was design, old design, pre-industrial design, the kind of design that evolution created over millennia instead of what agricultural scientists created in laboratories. June brought the first real test. The rain stopped. Not gradually, but abruptly, as if someone had turned off a faucet in the sky. Day after day of cloudless blue heat. The Weather Service issued drought warnings. Farmers checked their irrigation systems. Those without irrigation watched the sky and prayed. Marcus did not have irrigation. He never had. The cost was too high, and the well water was too deep. And his grandfather had farmed this land for 40 years without irrigation, so Marcus figured he could too. But now, watching the soil crack and the leaves begin to curl in the heat, he wondered if pride and tradition were about to cost him everything. The wheat turned from green to gold faster than it should have. Stressed crops matured early, trying to reproduce before they died. Marcus walked the fields in the white heat of noon, feeling the sun hammer down on his shoulders, feeling the dry wind suck moisture from his lungs, and he saw his wheat fighting for life. But it was still fighting. That was the thing. Tom Miller's field next door was also suffering, the plants wilting visibly, leaves browning at the edges. But Marcus's field, for all its chaos, for all its lack of uniformity, was holding on. Harvest came in early July. Marcus started cutting on the 7th, working from dawn until the dew fell at night, then starting again the next morning. The combine chewed through the irregular stand, the header bouncing over tall plants and short ones, the thrashing drum separating grain from chaff with a sound like distant thunder. The grain came clean. That surprised him. Despite the variation in plant height and maturity, the moisture levels were close enough that the grain stored well. 28 bushels per acre. Not spectacular, but far better than the county average, which was running around 22 that year. Tom Miller combined his fields a week later. 32 bushels per acre, thanks to his irrigation system that had cost him $40,000 to install. He drove past Marcus's place and honked, a triumphant sound, and Marcus waved back because what else could you do? But that night, lying in bed next to Sarah, Marcus did the math. Tom had spent $40,000 on irrigation. Marcus had spent nothing. Tom's extra 4 bushels per acre on his 3,000 acres came out to 12,000 bushels, worth maybe $36,000 at current prices. He would need 2 more years of drought to pay off the irrigation system. Marcus fell asleep doing calculations in his head, and his dreams were full of numbers and rain that never came. The fall of 1980 was dry. Winter was drier. By spring of 1981, the drought had a name. They were calling it the worst dry spell since the 50s, and meteorologists were using words like cycle and pattern and extended period. What they meant was that it was not going to end anytime soon. Marcus planted again in October 1980, using seed from his harvest. He saved back 80 bushels, enough for 180 acres. He had to borrow another $15,000 from the bank, and Stevens, the banker, made him sign papers that gave the bank first claim on the harvest. It was a bad deal, but it was the only deal available. Sarah went back to the diner for the winter. David stayed on, working for almost nothing, living on beans and hope. The 3 of them got through Christmas with a small tree and homemade gifts, and the knowledge that they were in this together, even if this was probably going to end badly. Spring came late and cold. The wheat germinated slowly, struggling up through soil that had almost no moisture. By May, the stand was thin and weak, plants 6 inches apart instead of the usual 3, leaves pale and stunted. And then the heat arrived. It came like an invading army, a high-pressure system that settled over the Great Plains and would not move. Day after day of temperatures over 100 degrees. No rain, no clouds, just sun and heat and wind that blew hot and dry from the southwest, sucking the last moisture from soil that was already approaching dust. The USDA declared Kansas a disaster area on June 15, 1981. Crop insurance adjusters started making rounds, taking photographs of failed fields for the federal relief programs. Farmers gave up and plowed under their wheat in June, something Marcus had never seen before. It was an admission of total defeat, and it spread across the county like a disease. Tom Miller's irrigation system ran 18 hours a day, pumping water from an aquifer that was dropping a foot per week. His electric bills were running $3,000 a month. His wheat survived, but barely, the plants short and stressed even with all that expensive water. Marcus's wheat should have died. By every measure of agricultural science, it should have withered and blown away. But it did not. It struggled, yes. It suffered, certainly. But it did not die. The plants went dormant during the hottest part of the day, leaves curled tight, conserving every molecule of moisture. Then at night, when temperatures dropped, they unfurled again, making use of the tiny amount of dew that formed. It was like watching something wild, Marcus thought. Like watching prairie grass or buffalo grass or some other plant that had evolved to survive on these plains long before humans showed up with their expectations and their irrigation systems. David saw it too. He spent hours walking the field, studying individual plants, taking notes in a composition book like some kind of scientist. "This should not be possible," David said one evening. They were sitting on the porch after dinner, drinking iced tea that Sarah had made with the last of the sugar. "The soil moisture is below wilting point. Way below. These plants should be dead." "But they are not," Marcus said. "No, they are not. Maybe my grandfather knew something." David looked at him in the fading light. "I think your grandfather knew a lot of things we forgot." The wheat limped to harvest in July. Marcus combined it on the 18th, working slowly through a stand so thin he could see bare ground between the rows. The yield was brutal, 18 bushels per acre, barely enough to cover his costs. The county average was 11 bushels per acre, the worst harvest in 50 years. Tom Miller combined 19 bushels per acre despite his irrigation. The drought was winning even against technology and money. He sold his crop for whatever he could get and announced that he was done with wheat. Next year would be all corn and soybeans, crops that responded better to irrigation. Marcus sold his grain to the local elevator and barely covered his loan payment. He had nothing left for living expenses. Sarah's diner wages kept them fed. David ate potatoes and gravy most nights. They were poor in a way that Marcus's grandfather would have recognized, poor in the way people got poor when the land turned against them. But they were still farming. That counted for something. The talk in town that fall was all about the drought. Meteorologists were saying it could last 5 years, maybe 10. Climate patterns were shifting. The rain shadow was expanding. Some farmers were talking about leaving, selling out to the big companies that could afford to pump water from deeper and deeper wells until the aquifer ran dry. Marcus went to the bank in September to ask for another loan. Stevens looked at his application like it was a suicide note. "I cannot approve this," Stevens said. "Your debt-to-income ratio is beyond acceptable limits. You are underwater, Mr. Brennan." "My grandfather farmed through the Dust Bowl," Marcus said. "This is not the Dust Bowl." "Not yet," Stevens agreed, "but it could be. And when it is, the bank cannot be holding paper on farms that do not produce." "One more year," Marcus said. "Give me one more year." Stevens stared at him across the desk. Why keep doing this? You could sell tomorrow. ConAgra would still buy. They always need more land. You could walk away with enough to retire on. Why keep fighting?" Marcus thought about that. He thought about William in Seattle, sending dutiful checks every month that Sarah cashed but Marcus never looked at. He thought about Sarah's hands, cracked and bleeding from washing dishes at the diner. He thought about David sleeping in a cold apartment because he believed in something he could not name but felt in his bones. "Because I made a promise," Marcus said finally, "to my grandfather, to my father, to the land. I am going to keep it until the land tells me I cannot." Stevens sighed. He pulled out forms and began filling them in with a pen that scratched across paper like a plow cutting dry earth. 10,000, Stevens said. "That is all I can do. And this is the last time, Marcus. If next year fails, the bank will foreclose. Do you understand that?" "I understand." Marcus signed papers that gave the bank claim on everything he owned. Then he walked out into September sunshine that felt like judgment and drove home to tell Sarah that they had one more year to prove that faith was stronger than economics. She cried when he told her, not from sadness exactly, from exhaustion and relief and terror all mixed together. Then she dried her eyes and started making plans for winter, because that was what she did. She made plans and she kept going, and she trusted that the man she married knew what he was doing even when evidence suggested otherwise. October came cool and dry. Marcus planted 180 acres again, using every seed from his meager harvest plus some he had held back from the year before. The germination was slower this time, the shoots emerging pale and thin from soil that had almost no organic matter left. November was colder than usual. December brought snow, but not much. The wheat went dormant under a thin white blanket, and Marcus prayed that it would survive the winter and have the strength to grow when spring came. If spring came. Because by January 1982, it was becoming clear that this was not a normal drought. This was something bigger. The high-pressure system had settled in like it planned to stay forever. Weather maps showed it stretched from Montana to Texas, a vast dome of dry air that blocked every moisture system trying to push in from the Pacific or the Gulf. The word Dust Bowl started appearing in newspapers. Comparisons to the 1930s, discussions of climate change and shifting rainfall patterns, and whether modern agriculture had disrupted natural cycles. Academics wrote papers. Talking heads argued on TV. But for farmers, it was simpler than all that. It just was not raining. Spring of 1982 came late and hot. By May, when the wheat should have been knee-high and lush, it was ankle-high and struggling. Marcus walked his field and saw plants that looked more dead than alive. He saw Tom Miller's irrigated field next door, also struggling despite thousands of gallons of pumped water every day. He saw the future, and the future looked like dust. Sarah stopped going to church. She said she could not sit there and listen to people pray for rain when God clearly was not listening. Marcus did not argue with her. He had stopped praying himself. He just worked and waited and watched the sky for clouds that never came. June brought temperatures that broke every record. 101 degrees on June 3rd, 104 on June 8th, 107 on June 15th. The heat was physical, a weight that pressed down on everything, suffocating and relentless. The wheat in Tom Miller's field turned brown and died despite irrigation. The electricity required to pump that much water had cost him so much that he could not afford to keep it running. He shut down his system on June 20th, and within a week, his entire 3,000 acres was dead. Brown stalks standing in cracked earth like grave markers. Marcus walked his own field on June 25th, and what he saw made him stop and stand very still. His wheat was not dead. It was not thriving, certainly. The plants were short, stunted, stressed beyond anything that should have been survivable, but they were green, some of them anyway. Maybe 40% of the plants were still photosynthesizing, still fighting, still alive. And more than that, they were different from each other in ways he had never noticed before. Some plants were barely a foot tall with deep red stems and roots that, when he dug one up, went down nearly 3 feet. Other plants were taller but thinner, with leaves that curled during the day to reduce water loss and opened at night. Still others were flowering early, racing to set seed before they died, producing small heads with just a few kernels each, but enough to ensure some kind of reproduction. 3 different survival strategies, 3 different adaptations, all in the same field, all descended from the same original stock, all expressing different genetic programs in response to the same brutal conditions. David saw it too. He came running to Marcus that evening, his composition book full of notes and sketches. "Marcus," David said, breathing hard from excitement, "you need to see this. Your wheat is not one variety. It is dozens, maybe hundreds. Every plant I looked at today had different characteristics. Different root depths, different leaf structures, different flowering times. It is like the seeds knew which genes to turn on based on the conditions." "That is not possible," Marcus said. "I know," David said, "but I am looking at it. We are both looking at it." They stood together at the edge of the field as the sun set behind them, painting the struggling wheat in shades of gold and red, and Marcus felt something shift in his understanding of what his grandfather had done. František had not brought one variety of wheat from Moravia. He had brought a library, a living archive of genetic possibilities that could express themselves differently depending on what the environment required. It was not contamination, it was insurance. July came hotter still. 108 degrees on July 4th, 110 on July 12th. The thermometer on the barn read 113 on July 19th, the hottest temperature ever recorded in that part of Kansas. Tom Miller sold his farm to ConAgra on July 23rd for $200,000, less than half what it had been worth 3 years before. He moved to Wichita to work in his brother's insurance office. Marcus went to his auction and bought some equipment cheap. A good disc, a cultivator, a truck that still ran. They shook hands at the end, and Tom looked at Marcus with something like respect. "I do not know how you are still standing," Tom said. "Stubbornness," Marcus replied. "Well, whatever it is, good luck. You are going to need it." Tom drove away in a moving truck loaded with everything he owned, and Marcus watched him go without regret or triumph. Just a quiet acknowledgement that some men were built for this life and some were not, and there was no shame in knowing which kind you were. The harvest came on August 2nd, the latest Marcus had ever combined. The wheat had struggled to maturity, taking an extra 3 weeks to fill out kernels that were smaller than normal but dense with protein. Marcus started cutting at dawn when the grain moisture was just barely low enough. The combine chewed through the irregular stand, and the grain came clean into the tank. And when Marcus stopped to empty the first load into his truck, he checked the bushel weight and then checked it again because he did not believe what he was seeing. 34 bushels per acre. It was impossible. The county average was going to be around 11 bushels, the worst in recorded history. Tom Miller had gotten 7 bushels with irrigation before his crop died. The university research plots had averaged 9 bushels with optimum management. And Marcus Brennan, farming with contaminated seed that the state had condemned, using no irrigation and no fancy inputs, had just harvested 34 bushels per acre. He called David over to verify. David checked the weight, checked the bushels, did the math 3 times. Then he sat down on the tailgate of the truck and started laughing, a wild sound that held tears and disbelief and something like vindication. "They cannot argue with this," David said. "They cannot say this is luck. This is science, real science, the kind that works." Marcus did not laugh. He just stood there in the August heat, looking at grain that should not have existed, grain that carried within it the wisdom of centuries, grain that had just proved that his grandfather was smarter than every agricultural scientist in Kansas. Then he got back in the combine and finished the harvest. The story spread fast. By August 10th, the local newspaper had run an article titled "Farmer Defies Drought with Heirloom Wheat." By August 15th, reporters from Wichita and Kansas City were calling. By August 20th, someone from the USDA had reached out requesting samples for analysis. And on August 24th, a woman named Dr. Catherine Morgan knocked on Marcus's door. Dr. Catherine Morgan arrived in a white sedan covered in highway dust, carrying a leather briefcase and the kind of determination that Marcus recognized immediately because he saw it in the mirror every morning. She was 38 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, and hands that showed she understood physical work. A scientist, yes, but not the laboratory kind who had never touched dirt. She wore jeans and boots and a Kansas State University polo shirt, and when she shook Marcus's hand, her grip was firm. "I read about your harvest in the Wichita paper," she said without preamble. 34 bushels per acre in drought conditions that produced 11 county-wide. That should not be possible with any wheat variety currently in production. I need to know how you did it. I planted seed, Marcus said, same as always. But not the same seed as everyone else. No, not the same. They stood in the yard between the house and the barn, and Sarah came out with iced tea because that was what you did when someone drove 200 miles to visit. Catherine accepted the glass gratefully and drank half of it in one long swallow. I am a plant geneticist, Catherine said. I specialize in stress tolerance in cereal crops. For 5 years, I have been trying to breed drought resistance into modern wheat varieties using genetic markers and controlled crosses. My best line produces 22 bushels per acre under severe drought. You just produced 34 with seed the state condemned as contaminated. I need to understand why. Marcus looked at David, who had come out of the machine shed when he heard the car. David shrugged, a gesture that said your call. Come see the field, Marcus said. They walked together, the three of them, out to the 180 acres that had just been harvested. The stubble stood uneven, some stalks tall, some short, the chaotic aftermath of a crop that had refused to be uniform. Catherine knelt and dug up several root systems, examining them with the kind of focus that blocked out everything else. Look at this variation, she said, more to herself than to them. This one has a taproot going down 2.5 feet. This one is shallow but highly branched. This one has mycorrhizal associations I have never seen in cultivated wheat. She stood up, brushing dirt from her knees. I need samples, multiple samples, seeds, roots, leaves, soil. I need to take them back to the lab at Kansas State. If what I think is happening here is actually happening, this could change everything we understand about crop adaptation. Take whatever you need, Marcus said. Catherine spent 3 hours collecting samples, filling plastic bags and vials with material that she labeled in precise handwriting. She photographed plants. She measured root depths. She took soil cores. David helped her, asking questions that showed he had been reading about plant genetics in his spare time, and Catherine answered him with the patience of someone who respected genuine curiosity. When she was done, she sat on the tailgate of her truck and looked at Marcus with an expression that mixed excitement and disbelief. If I am right, she said, and I think I am, you are not growing a variety. You are growing a population, a genetically diverse population that contains multiple adaptive strategies. Under normal conditions, that diversity would be invisible. All the plants would produce adequately. But under extreme stress, different genetic programs activate in different individuals. Some go deep for water. Some conserve water through leaf modification. Some race to reproduce before they die. The population as a whole survives because it is not trying to do everything the same way. Marcus nodded slowly. That is what my grandfather understood. Your grandfather was ahead of his time, Catherine said, or maybe behind it. Maybe he understood something that modern agriculture forgot in its rush to make everything uniform. She drove away with her samples, promising to call with results in 6 months. Marcus watched her go, and for the first time since David Hammond had condemned his seed 3 years before, he felt something like hope. The fall of 1982 was different from other falls. Farmers who had survived the drought were cautious, planting less, hedging their bets against another bad year. Farmers who had not survived were gone, their land absorbed by companies that farmed with spreadsheets and satellite data. Marcus planted 180 acres again, using seed from his impossible harvest. The germination was strong, 92%, and by November, the field was green and healthy. Rains came in December, good soaking rains that refilled the soil profile and made men talk about the drought being over as if weather were something you could declare finished like a war. But Marcus knew better. Drought was not an event. It was a cycle. It would come back. Maybe not next year, maybe not for 10 years, but it would come back, and when it did, his wheat would be ready because that was what it had been designed for across centuries of survival. William called on Christmas Eve. His voice on the phone was different, older somehow, as if the distance from home had aged him in ways that time alone could not. "How is the farm?" he asked. "Still standing," Marcus said. "I heard about your harvest. Made the news out here. They are calling you the drought farmer." "People call me lots of things." "Dad," William said, and then stopped. The line hummed with all the words he was trying to find. "I made a mistake. Leaving. I thought I was choosing the future, but I was just running from the past." "You have a good job," Marcus said. "Good pay, that matters." "It does not matter enough." Marcus closed his eyes. He was standing in the kitchen, the phone cord stretched across the room, and Sarah was watching him with an expression that said she could hear both sides of the conversation even though she could only hear one. "What are you saying?" Marcus asked quietly. "I am saying I want to come back. Not to visit, to stay, to farm, if you will have me." The words hung between them across 1,000 miles of telephone wire. Marcus looked at Sarah, and she nodded, tears already forming. "Come home," Marcus said. "The land is waiting." William arrived on New Year's Day 1983, driving the same Honda Civic he had left in, but something about him was different. His hands were still soft, but his eyes had changed. He had seen what the world outside offered, and he had chosen the world inside the fence line instead. David helped him move back into his old room. The two of them worked together through January and February, David teaching William everything he had learned about farming in the 2 years since he had left the Department of Agriculture. How to read weather, how to feel soil, how to know when wheat was ready by the sound the wind made through it. March brought Dr. Catherine Morgan back. She arrived with a van full of equipment and 2 graduate students, and an energy that made the cold Kansas spring feel warm. She set up in the barn, spreading papers and charts across workbenches, transforming the space into a temporary laboratory. "The results were better than I hoped," she said when they gathered that evening in the farmhouse. Sarah had made pot roast, and they sat around the table that Marcus Brennan had built in 1879, eating and listening while Catherine explained what she had found. "Your wheat is not one variety," she began. "It is not even 10 varieties. We identified 47 distinct genetic variants in the samples I collected. 47. Each one expressing different combinations of traits for root architecture, drought tolerance, disease resistance, and protein content." William leaned forward. "How is that possible? I thought seed companies spent decades breeding single traits into lines." "They do," Catherine said. "That is the problem. Modern breeding reduces diversity in the name of uniformity. We select for the one best plant and then clone it genetically through careful breeding. The result is crops that are incredibly productive under ideal conditions but incredibly fragile under stress." "And my grandfather's wheat," Marcus said. "Is the opposite," Catherine finished. "It is unproductive under ideal conditions compared to modern varieties, but under stress, it is nearly indestructible because it has so many different survival strategies built in. Some of these genetic variants trace back to emmer wheat from ancient Egypt. Some trace to spelt from medieval Europe. Some we cannot identify at all. They may predate agriculture entirely." The room fell silent. David broke it first. "You are saying that this wheat is a living library of genetic traits that modern agriculture has systematically eliminated." "Exactly," Catherine said. "And those traits are now worth more than gold because climate change means drought will be the new normal. This wheat contains genes for deep roots that can access water at depths modern varieties cannot reach. It contains genes for protein levels of 16 to 22% when modern wheat averages 11 to 13. It contains disease resistance genes we did not even know existed. What do you want to do with this information? Marcus asked. Catherine set down her fork and looked at him directly. I want to preserve it, document it, study it, use it to develop new varieties that can help farmers survive what is coming. But I need your permission. This is your wheat, your family's legacy. I will not do anything with it that you do not approve. Marcus thought about that. He thought about his grandfather crossing an ocean with seeds in a wooden trunk. He thought about his father planting those seeds year after year through dust bowls and depressions. He thought about his own 3 years of fighting against inspectors and droughts, and the weight of a world that valued uniformity over survival. Use it, Marcus said, but under conditions. Catherine pulled out a notebook. Tell me. First, Marcus said, any varieties you develop from this wheat must be freely available to small farmers. No patents, no restrictions. Anyone who wants to grow it can grow it. Agreed, Catherine said, writing. Second, the original line must be preserved exactly as it is. No modifications, no improvements. Just keep it alive and available in case we need it again. Also agreed. Third, Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. Any publication or presentation must acknowledge that this wheat survived because it was considered contaminated by government standards. I want people to understand that what saved it was precisely what made it illegal to sell. Catherine smiled. That is the part I am most looking forward to writing. Over the next 3 months, Catherine and her team worked with Marcus to create a comprehensive seed bank. They collected samples from every plant in the field, documenting the variations, cataloging the traits, preserving the genetics in temperature-controlled storage at Kansas State. They took photographs. They recorded oral histories. They turned a condemned seed lot into a scientific treasure. The paper Catherine published in June 1983 appeared in the Journal of Agricultural Science with a title that made Marcus smile. Genetic Diversity as Drought Insurance, a case study in heirloom wheat populations. It included photographs of his field, graphs of his yields compared to commercial varieties, and genetic analysis that proved beyond doubt that diversity was strength. The agricultural community responded with a mixture of excitement and embarrassment. Researchers recognized that they had been breeding in the wrong direction for decades. Seed companies quietly began programs to reintroduce genetic diversity into their lines, and farmers started asking questions about where they could get seed like Marcus Brennan's. But the official recognition came from a different source. On a Tuesday morning in August 1983, a letter arrived from the Kansas Department of Agriculture. Marcus opened it standing by the mailbox, and he read it twice before he believed what it said. The department wished to inform him that the seed inspection failure of September 1979 was being officially overturned. Upon review of new scientific evidence, the department recognized that the genetic diversity previously classified as contamination was in fact a valuable agricultural trait. The department extended its apologies for any hardship caused by the original ruling. It was signed by the current Director of Agriculture and countersigned by the Governor of Kansas. David was working on the tractor when Marcus showed him the letter. He read it slowly, then sat down on the ground and put his head in his hands. I ruined 3 years of your life, David said. 3 years. I am so sorry, Marcus. Marcus sat down next to him. You were doing your job. A job built on ignorance. Then you learned better. That is all anyone can do. They sat together in the machine shed that still smelled like his grandfather's work. 2 men who had started as something like enemies and had become something like brothers. And they did not speak because some things went deeper than words. The next recognition came from the USDA, a formal letter requesting samples of the Brennan wheat for inclusion in the National Seed Storage Laboratory in Fort Collins, Colorado. They wanted to preserve it for future generations, alongside other rare and valuable crop varieties. They offered to pay $500,000 for perpetual access to the genetics. Marcus read the letter to Sarah and William and David at dinner that evening. When he finished, Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. "That is more money than we have made in our entire lives," she said. "It is," Marcus agreed. "What are you going to do?" Marcus looked around the table at the people who had stood with him through the worst years. Sarah, who had worked herself nearly to death so he could keep farming. David, who had given up everything he knew to learn a better way. William, who had come home because he finally understood what mattered. "I am going to refuse it," Marcus said. The room fell silent. "Not all of it," Marcus continued. "I will give them the samples. I will let them preserve the genetics, but I will not take payment. Instead, I will make the same conditions I gave Dr. Morgan. Free access for small farmers. No patents. And the original line stays with this family, to be passed down the same way my grandfather passed it to my father and my father passed it to me." "You could retire," Sarah said gently. "We could pay off every debt. We could live comfortably for the rest of our lives." "I do not need comfortable," Marcus said. "I need to know that this wheat will survive. Money cannot buy that. Only commitment can." William spoke for the first time. "I will make that commitment, Dad. I will keep the line going. I will pass it to my children the way you are passing it to me." Marcus looked at his son, and in that moment he saw not just William but all the Brennans who had come before. František with his wooden trunk, Marcus's father with his quiet determination. The whole chain of men who had understood that some things mattered more than profit or ease or the approval of the modern world. "Good," Marcus said simply. The USDA accepted his terms. They sent researchers who collected seeds and documented the collection practices and promised to maintain the diversity in perpetual storage. They established the Brennan Heritage Wheat Collection as a formal designation, ensuring that future generations would know where it came from and who had preserved it. In September 1983, the Kansas Department of Agriculture held a formal ceremony at the state fair. They presented Marcus with a plaque recognizing him as Kansas Farmer of the Year. The governor gave a speech about agricultural innovation and the importance of preserving genetic diversity. Reporters took photographs. The local television station did a segment for the evening news. Marcus stood on the stage in his best clothes, which were still just clean jeans and a pressed shirt, and he felt uncomfortable with all the attention. He had not farmed for recognition. He had farmed because it was what his family did, what the land required, what the seeds deserved. But when they asked him to say a few words, he walked to the microphone and looked out at the crowd of farmers and officials and curious onlookers, and he spoke the truth as he understood it. "My grandfather came to this country with nothing but seeds and faith," Marcus said. "The seeds were not pure by modern standards. They were mixed, contaminated, unfit for sale according to laws that did not exist when he planted them. But they survived when pure seeds failed. They adapted when uniform crops died. They thrived in conditions that should have killed them. I am standing here today not because I was smarter than other farmers, but because I trusted my grandfather more than I trusted the experts. Sometimes the old ways survive because they are better, not because we are too stubborn to change." The crowd applauded, but Marcus did not hear it. He was thinking about František walking across frozen prairie in 1879, scattering seeds by hand, praying that they would take root in soil he did not yet understand. He was thinking about his father combining wheat with horses and a McCormick reaper that had to be repaired with wire and hope. He was thinking about every generation that had bet their lives on those seeds and won. He walked off the stage and out of the fairgrounds and drove home to the farm because there was work to do, and recognition did not change that. The years that followed were different. The drought broke in 1984. Rains came regular and generous, and Kansas returned to being the wheat state that geography intended. Marcus's yields went up, but never to the levels of commercial varieties under ideal conditions. His wheat still varied. It still looked chaotic, but farmers were asking for his seed now, paying premium prices for genetics that could survive the next inevitable drought. David stayed on and became the manager of the seed operation. He handled orders and shipping, working from a small office they built in the barn. The business grew slowly but steadily. By 1986, they were selling seed to farmers in 7 states. By 1988, the income from seed sales had finally paid off the $200,000 in debt that had hung over the farm like a storm cloud for nearly a decade. When Marcus made the final payment to the bank, Stevens the banker shook his hand and said he had never doubted him, which they both knew was a lie but also a kindness. David married in 1984, a woman from town named Rebecca who had lost her husband to cancer and raised 2 children alone. He built a house on the South 40 acres that Marcus sold him for $1 and a handshake. He was happy in a way that desk work had never made him happy, and sometimes Marcus saw him standing in the wheat field at sunset with that same expression of wonder that meant a man had found his place. William learned to farm the way Marcus's father had taught Marcus, through work and observation, and the kind of knowledge that could not be written in books. He married in 1985, a woman from Nebraska named Claire who understood land and legacy because her family had farmed for 4 generations. They had a son in 1987, and they named him Jakob after František's father, reaching back across generations to honor the chain that had brought them all here. Sarah quit the diner when the debt was paid in 1988. She spent her days in the garden and her evenings on the porch, watching the wheat grow and the sun set and the seasons turn. Her hands healed. Her feet stopped aching. She grew old gracefully, the way women did when they had survived hard things and come through stronger. Marcus turned 60 in 1992. The farm was stable. The seed business was thriving under David's management. William was ready to take over the farming operation. Everything was in place for the transition that every family farm had to make eventually, from one generation to the next. But Marcus was not ready to retire. He still walked the fields every morning. He still checked the wheat for disease or stress or any of the 1,000 things that required attention. He still felt responsible to his grandfather in a way that had nothing to do with legal ownership and everything to do with honor. The decades passed with the steady rhythm of planting and harvest. William took over more of the daily operations. Jakob grew from a baby to a boy to a young man, working on the farm every summer, learning the same lessons Marcus had learned at the same age. The seed business expanded to 15 states by the mid-90s. Other farmers began preserving their own heirloom varieties, inspired by the Brennan example. The movement grew quietly, without fanfare, just farmers helping farmers the way it had always been. On a Sunday afternoon in 2004, Marcus was 72 years old and standing in the seed barn with William and Jakob. The boy was 17 now, tall and lean with his grandfather's eyes and his great-great-great-grandfather's stubborn chin. He had just finished his junior year of high school and was already talking about studying agronomy at Kansas State, not to leave farming, but to bring new knowledge back to it. Marcus opened the tin box that František had brought from Moravia in 1878. The seeds inside were brown and dry, no longer viable for planting but preserved as a kind of reference. a standard, a reminder. These seeds crossed an ocean, Marcus told Jacob. They survived because they were different from each other, not uniform, not perfect, just different, and that difference saved them when perfect seeds died. Jacob touched the seeds carefully, respectfully. Why did people want them to be the same? Because people like things they can predict, Marcus said. They like knowing what they will get. But nature does not work that way. Nature survives through diversity, through having many different solutions to the same problem. Your great-great-great-grandfather understood that. He knew that the seeds the experts called contaminated were really just seeds that had options. "Will you teach me to farm this way?" Jacob asked. "Your father will teach you," Marcus said, "and you will teach your children. That is how it works. That is how knowledge survives." They walked out of the barn together into late afternoon light that painted the wheat fields gold. The crop that year was strong and healthy, green turning to amber as harvest approached. It looked chaotic if you did not understand what you were seeing. Different heights, different colors, different everything. But if you knew what to look for, you saw something else. You saw resilience. You saw adaptation. You saw the genetic wisdom of centuries expressed in every plant. Marcus put his hand on Jacob's shoulder, and they stood together at the edge of the field, 3 generations looking at the same land that František had looked at in 1879. "Remember this," Marcus said to his grandson. "When people tell you that different is wrong, that diverse is weak, that everything should be the same, remember that this wheat survived not despite its differences, but because of them. Remember that what saved us was exactly what they tried to destroy." Jacob nodded, serious beyond his years. "I will remember, Grandpa." "Good," Marcus said, "because someday you will have to defend it. The world has a short memory for lessons like this. Every generation has to learn them again." They turned and walked back toward the house where Sarah had dinner waiting. Behind them, the wheat whispered in the wind, each plant speaking in its own voice, together creating a harmony that no uniform crop could ever match. Marcus did not know if Jacob would keep the farm or if the boy would find his calling elsewhere. He did not know if the world would remember the drought of 1982 or the lesson it taught. He did not know what the future held for family farms or heirloom seeds or any of the things he had spent his life protecting. But he knew this. The seeds were preserved. The knowledge was passed down. The chain was unbroken. The debt that had nearly destroyed them was paid. The business that David built had given them stability. And somewhere in a temperature-controlled vault in Colorado, in seed banks across Kansas, in fields worked by farmers who understood that diversity was strength, František Brennan's wheat was still alive. Still adapting, still surviving, still teaching anyone wise enough to listen that perfection was the enemy of resilience, that uniformity was the opposite of strength, and that the things the world called contaminated were sometimes the very things that saved it. Marcus climbed the porch steps slowly, his knees complaining about 72 years of labor. Sarah met him at the door with a kiss and a smile that said she knew exactly what he had been doing out there with Jacob. Behind them, William was setting the table. Claire was helping Sarah with the gravy. The smell of pot roast filled the house. It was just another Sunday on a family farm in Kansas. Nothing special, nothing remarkable. Just 3 generations under one roof, sharing a meal, keeping a promise to a man who had crossed an ocean with seeds in a wooden trunk and faith in his heart. And that, Marcus thought as he sat down at the table his grandfather had built, was everything that mattered. The wheat in the fields outside was not perfect. It would never be perfect, but it was alive in a way that perfect things could never be. It carried within its genes the memory of drought and survival, of ocean crossings and prairie winters, of inspectors and droughts, and the stubborn refusal of men who knew that some things should not change even when the whole world insisted they must. It was contaminated wheat, illegal wheat, the wrong kind of wheat. And it was the only kind of wheat that really mattered.